The ruins of the Tucket homestead. The Wyoming wind carried the acrid sting of ash, sweeping low over the charred skeleton of what had once been the Tucket homestead. Smoke still curled from the blackened beams, rising sluggishly into a sky the color of a dying ember, orange fading into a bruise-purple horizon. The earth beneath Zora Tucket's bare feet was warm, almost blistering, but she barely felt it. Her dress was torn at the hem, the fabric stiff with soot and sweat. Her arms bore streaks of ash like war paint, and her chest rose and fell not with the rhythm of running, but with the uneven, jagged breath of someone who could not yet believe what her eyes told her. The cabin roof had collapsed in on itself. The barn, once sturdy enough to weather any winter storm, lay in smoldering heaps. The corral fence was split and trampled the soil, gouged deep by frantic hooves. And there, by the half-burned remains of the porch, was the rifle she'd dropped, its barrel warped from the heat. Zora's gaze roamed over the wreckage, as if her mind still searched for another outcome, one where the walls were still standing, one where the voices of her children carried on the wind. But there was only the crackle of dying flames and the hiss of burning timbers collapsing inward. The land had gone too quiet, the kind of silence that swallows sound instead of letting it echo. Her heartbeat drummed in her ears, drowning out the faint whisper of the prairie grass. Every scent was smoke and scorched earth, but beneath it a phantom trace lingered: soap on her daughter's dress, the sun-baked leather of her son's boots. Her hands twitched useless, without something to hold, and her knees weakened under the weight of what she was seeing. Zora knew the Wyoming plains could take anything: livestock, crops, even a man's life, but she had not thought they would take her children. The moment of loss. The memory was already a blur, but its pieces came in flashes sharp enough to cut. First the ground trembling under the pounding of hooves, fast many of them coming from the east, then the sharp, ugly crack of gunfire slicing the afternoon calm. She had shouted for Vera and Victor, her voice half swallowed by the wind, and when they came running, wide-eyed, she had shoved them beneath the loose boards in the floor, the place she'd told them was only for hide-and-seek. They hadn't understood. Her fingers had found the rifle by instinct. The first shot went clean, the recoil snapping into her shoulder. The second missed as a rider swerved, the third hit someone hard enough to wrench a scream into the chaos. But there had been too many, their silhouettes blurring through the smoke and dust. One horse plowed past, so close, its flank brushed her hip, knocking her back. She'd fired until the chamber clicked empty, then grabbed for anything, a hammer, a plank, before a heavy blow to her side took her down. When she came to, the air was thick, choking. The barn was an inferno, flames spilling out like the tongues of some furious beast. Her ears rang, her mouth tasted of copper, and her limbs ached with a deep, bruised throb. She staggered toward the cabin, already knowing in some unspoken, gut-deep way what she'd find. The boards she'd pulled over her children's heads were cast aside. The small, dust-lined hollow beneath was empty, and the world tilted under her feet. Her voice tore itself from her chest, a raw, guttural scream that rose above the crackling fire and into the open sky, only to be met with the indifference of the wind. The arrival of Jarth Nalan, Zora. The voice cut through the smoke like a blade, snapping her head toward the ridge. Through the wavering heat and haze, she saw him, dark hat pulled low, rifle across his back, his horse's flanks lathered from the hard ride. He urged the animal down the slope, dust kicking up behind them, and slid from the saddle before it had even stopped. His boots struck the earth with the solid finality of a man who didn't waste movements. For a second, She didn't recognize him, not in this place, not after so many years, but then the lines of his face fell into place, the faint scar by his jaw. The set of his mouth, the eyes that once laughed easily, but now burned with something harder. Jarth Nalan. Her childhood friend, the boy who used to race her barefoot down the river banks, who once filled her apron with stolen apples and swore her to secrecy. 6 years gone, and yet here he was. He knelt beside her hands, hovering as though afraid to touch what might break. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. She swallowed against the tightness in her throat. "They took my children." His jaw set. "How long ago? Half an hour, maybe less." 5, maybe 6 men. They rode north. He didn't hesitate. His gaze dropped to the ground, finding the hoof prints before the wind could erase them. "Get your boots." She didn't argue. In moments, she was inside the half-standing frame of her home, pulling them on, with fingers that trembled more from rage than fear. By the time she stepped back out, he'd brought her old gelding from the paddock, somehow untouched by the fire. He handed her the reins, eyes steady. "We ride hard. Tell me the rest on the way." And without another word, they turned their horses toward the smoke-dimmed horizon. The pursuit begins. The smoke thinned as they rode north, but its smell clung to Zora's skin, her hair, the folds of her dress. Her gelding's stride was uneven at first. He'd been penned too long, but Jarth set a pace that brooked no hesitation. The land shifted beneath them from scorched earth to the dry grass of summer, and then into the darker green where cottonwoods clustered by the stream beds. Zora's hands were tight on the reins, knuckles pale, but her eyes stayed fixed ahead as if sheer will could draw the riders into view. Jarth didn't waste words. When he spoke, it was short-pointed. "Tell me," he said, scanning the brush as they went. She told him everything, the pounding hooves, the bandanas masking their faces, the rough leather gloves that grabbed for her rifle. How one of them had laughed a short, cruel sound when he saw the children's hiding place. She described their mounts, 2 bays, a paint with a white blaze, a pair of roans. None of the animals bore the brands she knew from the neighboring ranches. They didn't have colors, she finished, her voice hitching. Not like the gangs from the south. No markings. Just guns and hands that knew how to take. Jarth nodded once, his gaze sweeping the low ridge to their left. The rifle lay easy across his lap, but there was a tension in the set of his shoulders that told her he was counting, measuring, always ready. Men like that don't wander far without a reason, he said. And they don't take children unless they've got something in mind. The words made her stomach turn, but she bit them back. Instead, she pressed her heels to the gelding's flanks, matching Jarth's stride for stride. The hoofbeats a hard, steady drum against the earth. The first sign. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped enough to stretch the shadows long across the trail. It was Jarth who spotted it. First, something pale snagged on the thorn of a low shrub beside the track. He swung down from the saddle boots, crunching in the dry earth, and reached for it. A handkerchief, dirt-smudged with a lopsided red V stitched into one corner. Zora was off her horse before he could say her name. She snatched it from his hand, clutching it so tightly the fabric crumpled between her fingers. "Vera," she whispered, her voice breaking on the first syllable. She'd taught her daughter that stitch the clumsy way to loop the thread that always tilted the letter to the right. The cloth still held the faint scent of lye soap and lavender oil. "They dropped it to taunt us," Jarth said, scanning the tree line. Means they don't know we're behind them. Zora's breath came unevenly, but she forced herself to steady it. Then we make sure they never do. She tucked the handkerchief inside her bodice close enough to feel its softness against her skin and swung back into the saddle. Jarth mounted up beside her, giving one last look to the trail ahead before urging his horse forward. The tracks were fresh here, sharper edged than before. Whoever they weren't moving as fast now, and that gave her hope, a dangerous, burning kind of hope that could keep her upright long past exhaustion. The first night, they made camp in a small copse of pines where the branches grew low enough to hide their fire. Jarth kept the flame so small it was little more than a glow between them, just enough to take the bite out of the night air. The ground smelled of pine sap and old needles, a scent that clung to the back of Zora's throat. She sat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring into the orange flicker, every muscle tight. "You came back," she said finally, her voice barely above the wind's whisper. "I never stopped watching over you," he replied, not looking away from the shadows beyond their camp. She studied his profile, the deeper lines around his eyes, the way his jaw seemed harder now. "I heard about Ethan." Jarth's eyes flickered to hers, the firelight catching in them. "I should have come sooner. You didn't owe me anything." His gaze held hers, then steady, as if weighing every word. "I did. Always did." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with all the years they hadn't spoken, all the things left unsaid. Zora stared into the fire until her vision blurred, but the warmth at her side wasn't just from the flames. She didn't realize she'd leaned into him until her temple rested lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move away, discovering the camp. By midday the next day the air had shifted. It was cooler in the hollows, the scent of water threading through the dust and pine resin. Jarth slowed his horse near the crest of a rise, raising one hand for silence. Zora eased her gelding in beside him, her breath sharp in her ears. From here the land dipped into a shallow basin where the river curled slow and brown, catching glints of sun through the trees. "There," Jarth murmured. She followed his gaze. 3 canvas tents stood in a loose semicircle near the water's edge, their fabric patched and stained. 6 horses were tied to a rough line strung between 2 trees. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the remains of a cooking fire, its scent faint but acrid enough to make her throat tighten. And then she saw them, 2 small figures by a central post. Vera's hair hung in tangled ropes over her shoulders. Victor's bare feet were caked in dirt. They were tied with a single length of rope, close enough to touch, but far from any shelter. Even from this distance, Zora could see the slump of her daughter's shoulders, the way Victor's head tipped forward as if too heavy to hold up. Her hand shot to her mouth to keep the sound inside. Jarth's eyes stayed on the camp, his body still measuring every movement below. "We wait until nightfall," he said, voice so low it was almost swallowed by the wind. She nodded, though every fiber of her wanted to charge down now. Tears tracked silently through the dust on her cheeks, catching in the corners of her mouth. "You're not alone," Zora Jarth said, his tone rough, final. Not anymore. In the dark night came slow the sun bleeding into the horizon until the basin was washed in blue shadow. The campfires below had burned down to faint coals, their glow barely visible through the trees. Jarth moved first, a shadow among shadows, his steps silent on the pine needles. Zora followed the rifle clutched to her chest, every nerve screaming with the need to reach her children. The first man never saw Jarth coming. A flash of steel, a quick twist, and the outlaw crumpled soundlessly to the ground. Jarth dragged him into the deeper dark, without a word. The second man turned at the faint thud, his hand going to his pistol. Zora didn't think she raised her rifle, the barrel steady despite the hammering in her chest, and fired once. The report shattered the night. He dropped where he stood. Chaos burst open like a gunshot in a canyon. A shout went up. Someone fired blindly into the trees. One of the outlaws charged Jarth, pistol in hand. They collided in the dirt, rolling fists swinging. Jarth slammed the man's head against a rock, the dull crack lost under the sound of gunfire. Zora ducked behind a tent, reloading. A bullet tore through the canvas beside her ear, the sound a vicious rip. She spun, fired again, and the last man near her fell, his pistol tumbling from his grasp. And then silence. Only the hiss of dying embers and the distant rush of the river. Reunion. Jarth was on his feet before the smoke settled, his breath coming in sharp pull. He crossed the clearing in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees beside the post. His knife flashed once, twice, and the ropes binding Vera and Victor fell away. Vera launched herself into his arms, her small hands gripping the back of his neck like she'd never let go. Victor stumbled straight into Zora's skirts, his face pressed hard into her legs, his fingers twisting the fabric as if to anchor himself. Zora dropped to her knees, wrapping them both in her arms, her body shaking with the force of holding them. She could feel their hearts pounding against her, rapid and alive. Her throat closed around every word she wanted to say. When she finally looked up, Jarth was standing nearby, his sleeve streaked with blood. She couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's, but his eyes were steady on her. "You still got a home right here." He said the words rough, with something unspoken. She clutched the children closer, the weight of them both anchoring her in a way nothing else could. For the first time since the smoke rose over her land, she believed him, planning for the future. They didn't linger in the hollow after the fight. The bodies were left where they fell, the fire doused with a bootful of dirt. Jarth gathered what he could from the camp. Extra cartridges, a half-empty sack of jerky, a battered water canteen, while Zora settled the children near the horses. Vera sat in the dirt, her hands wrapped around her knees, eyes fixed on the flicker of Jarth's lantern. Victor leaned against her, too exhausted to lift his head. "We can't stay here." "Come sundown," Jarth said when he returned, his voice low. "They might have had others out on a ride. Could be back by morning." Zora nodded, brushing the hair from Victor's forehead. "I know. My sister's up in Fort Bridger, but she's already got 7 mouths to feed. I can't ask her to shelter us." Jarth adjusted the cinch on his saddle, glancing over his shoulder. "There's a place I know," he said. "Small spread east of the Big Horns. Quiet, keeps to itself. Been empty since the widow who owned it passed. I've been fixing it up when I'm not working cattle." She studied him, unsure whether to believe the sudden offer. "You've been staying there, off and on. Roof's tight. Stone hearth. Well, runs clear. No one comes looking." He looked away, then breaking a twig in his hand. "Guess I kept hoping I'd have someone to share it with sooner or later." The words sat between them like an ember in the dark small, but with the weight of fire behind it. Zora glanced at the children. "They'll need schooling," she said. "There's a schoolhouse in the valley," he replied. "Teacher comes from Johnson County in the spring." She drew in a slow breath. How far? 3 days' ride if we take the ridge path. Safer than the open plains. Her answer was a single nod. Then we ride at first light, the journey to the valley. They rose before dawn, the sky still ink-black and cold enough to turn their breath white. Jarth packed the supplies in silence, his movements precise. Zora got the children mounted, Victor in front of Jarth, Vera riding behind her. The gelding's ears twitched at the faint stirrings of wind through the cottonwoods, but he stepped into the trail without hesitation. The ridge path wound through country that felt carved by time itself. By mid-morning they rode through a canyon where the rock walls blushed gold under the sun. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed in the narrow pass, mixing with the distant call of a hawk overhead. In the meadows beyond, elk lifted their heads to watch them pass, their breath misting in the cool air. At night, they camped by the bend of a river, the water dark and glassy under the stars. The children slept quickly, curled together beneath a wool blanket. Zora sat by the fire, her arms around her knees, watching the orange light dance across the curve of the river bank. "They've taken to you," she said once the quiet had settled. Jarth sat a few feet away, boots planted in the dirt, elbows on his knees. "I've always liked children," he said. "Never had any of my own." "Did you ever come close?" she asked. He shook his head, the fire catching the edges of his profile. "There was a girl years back, but she wanted a man who stayed put. I wasn't ready then." She looked into the flames. "And now, when I saw you standing in that smoke," he said, his voice low, "something settled in me." Zora turned toward him, her brow furrowed. "You don't owe me anything, Jarth." "It's not about owing," he said, eyes meeting hers. "It's about what's worth staying for." Arrival at the cabin. The third day dawned clear and sharp, the kind of morning where the air seemed to ring with light. By mid-morning the ridge opened into a wide valley, the river curling silver through the center. Cottonwoods dotted the fields, their leaves whispering in the wind. The cabin stood near the edge of a grove, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. The shutters were closed against the wind, but the stone hearth stood solid, and a corral half-mended sat nearby. A lean-to held stacked firewood and a rusted plow. Zora dismounted slowly, lifting Vera down before stepping back to take in the sight. "It's quiet," she said. "Too quiet?" Jarth asked. She shook her head. "No, the kind that holds." While he led the horses to water, she took the children inside. The single room smelled faintly of pine and old ash. The beds were made with clean wool blankets, and a small shelf by the wall held a carved wooden horse, its surface smoothed by years of touch. Victor picked it up and pressed it to his chest without a word. That night, when the children were asleep beneath the quilts, Zora stepped outside. The stars burned sharp above her, and the wind carried the scent of sage from the hills. Jarth stood by the fence line, 1 foot on the bottom rail, watching the dark horizon. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "You are now," he replied. She looked up at him, the truth plain in her voice. "You didn't have to come for us, but you did. You were never just anyone to me, Zora." Her hand found his, their fingers lacing without hesitation. "I want to make a life here," she said. "If you'll have us." "You still got a home right here," he told her. And for the first time in days, she let herself believe it, preparing for the cold. The first frost came earlier than Zora expected, silvering the grass before the aspens had finished turning. Mornings were brittle with cold, the kind that made the breath feel sharp in the lungs. Jarth stacked the last of the seasoned oak against the cabin wall, his hands raw from the work bark dust clinging to his sleeves. Inside, Zora stitched a wool lining into Vera's coat by lantern light, the needle flashing in and out of the fabric with practiced rhythm. Victor sat cross-legged on the floor, scraps of pine scattered around him. His small hands worked stubbornly at carving a bird from a crooked branch, the blade dull but safe enough. He leaned forward in deep concentration, tongue poking from the side of his mouth. When Jarth came back in, he paused just inside the doorway, brushing sawdust from his coat. "Roof's held through every storm so far," he said. "That ridge beam's not going anywhere this winter." Zora glanced up from her sewing. "I've never seen a fire draw so clean. Not once has it smoked back." He crouched beside Victor, taking the knife gently from the boy's hand. "You're pushing too hard," he said. He shaved a thin curl from the wood, letting it fall to the floor. "Let the blade do the work." Victor watched wide-eyed, then tried again, this time more slowly. Zora's gaze lingered on them. "You always know how to quiet people," she said softly, "even when there's noise in them." Jarth didn't look up. "Noise doesn't scare me. It's the silence that tells you the truth, why he came back." Later that week, the sky cleared to a hard, bright blue, and the air turned knife-sharp after sunset. Zora stepped onto the porch, her shawl pulled close, the boards creaking beneath her boots. Jarth joined her after a moment, hat in hand, his breath drifting pale in the moonlight. "I never asked," she said, her voice quiet against the night. "What made you come back through Powder River country?" "Cattle run went bad south of Casey," he said. "Ended up taking a job driving a string through the Big Horns. After that, I couldn't ride past without checking on you. You didn't know I was still here," she pointed out. He looked toward the hills. "I hoped." The stillness between them was broken only by the distant cry of a coyote, one sharp note that faded into silence. "When Ethan died," she said, "folks told me to pack up, take the children back east. I tried to believe them for a while. What stopped you?" She gazed at the valley below. "I knew this land better than I knew my own face. I knew when to plant, which trees would hold through wind, how the stream shifts after a hard summer. I couldn't start over somewhere I didn't understand." Jarth studied her in profile. "You think you understand this place. I think it understands me," she said. His nod was slow. "Then I was right to bring you here. A promise to stay." Snow came soft that first night, drifting in slow spirals from a sky the color of pewter. Zora stood beside Jarth near the fence line, their coats brushing when the wind shifted. The glow from the cabin windows spilled warm across the snow at their feet. "I've known men," Jarth said, "who spend their whole lives chasing things they didn't know they needed. I nearly became one of them." Zora looked at him, her breath steady despite the cold. She didn't need to answer. The truth between them was already there. "But I don't want to chase anymore," he added. "Neither do I," she said. They didn't move for a long moment, only the snow gathering soft on their shoulders. Jarth reached for her hand, his fingers warm despite the chill. She didn't let go. The valley around them was quiet, the kind that wasn't empty but full of promise, full of the certainty that they would face whatever came next together. A steadier life. By midwinter, the cabin had taken on the rhythm of a home. Jarth's days began before first light, the crunch of his boots in the frost as he crossed to the barn. Zora would be awake when he returned, the smell of coffee curling into the rafters, while Vera and Victor stirred under their quilts. Snow lay thick over the pasture, muffling sound, but inside the walls there was always movement, mending, tending the fire, checking the stock feed, scraping ice from the water trough. One late afternoon, Zora was folding the hem of one of Vera's dresses by the hearth, while Jarth sat at the table ledger, open, a pencil tucked behind his ear. The children sprawled on the floor, sketching in charcoal on scraps of brown paper. She looked up and asked, "You ever think about building on?" Jarth glanced over the top of the ledger. "Building on a second room," she said. "So Vera doesn't have to share with Victor when she's older." He leaned back, tapping the pencil against the page. "I could draw something out. Might take till spring to haul in the lumber from Buffalo." "I'd help raise it," she said. "I never doubted that." His eyes met hers for a moment, something quiet passing between them, less tentative than before, more like the trust you don't have to question. That night, when the children were asleep, Zora stepped outside with a basin to toss the wash water. The sky was black and sharp with stars. She stood still for a moment, the cold biting through her sleeves, the quiet pressing in like a warm blanket. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Jarth came out carrying her shawl. "You left this," he said, draping it over her shoulders. She caught his hand as he pulled away. "Sometimes I get lost in the stillness." "You miss the noise?" he asked. "No," she said, eyes on the tree line. "I just never knew what peace sounded like." The proposal. They stood for a while, watching their breath fade into the cold air. Jarth shifted his weight, his voice low. "You think this might last? I think we've both seen enough to know not to waste it," she replied. "You feel settled. I feel like I can breathe again." He nodded, then looked toward the barn. "I've been thinking about putting in a smokehouse for meat and hides. Maybe trade with a trapper up by Crazy Woman Creek. He comes down before the melt." He hesitated. "And if we're going to send the children to school in the spring, maybe we ought to marry before then." The words landed between them without fanfare, but they carried weight. Zora turned to face him fully, the shawl slipping down her arm. "You're not asking out of duty?" "No. You're sure I knew the answer the moment I saw you in that smoke rifle in hand? I just didn't know when I'd get to say it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Say it now." "I want you beside me," he said. "Not for a season, for whatever years we've got left." Zora stepped closer, her hands resting against his chest. "Then I will marry you, Jarth Nalan. Not because it's easier, but because you're the only man I've ever trusted to see all of me and stay." He pulled her into his arms, the cold, forgotten the quiet around them holding fast. Wedding. Under the cottonwood. The wedding took place in late November, when the pasture grass lay dusted with snow, and frost curled like lace at the cabin windows. Jarth had fashioned the rings himself, from a length of silver wire he'd bargained off a passing tinker, hammering and shaping them on the anvil block in the shed. Zora wore her mother's brooch pinned at her collar, a simple oval of silver set with a piece of river-polished turquoise. Vera tucked a spray of dried yarrow into her braid, insisting it would bring luck. They stood beneath the cottonwood tree at the edge of the property, its branches bare but strong. The preacher from the valley arrived on a borrowed mule, his Bible wrapped in oilcloth against the wind. Victor stood beside Jarth, his small fists jammed into his coat pockets, while Vera clung to her mother's hand, her gaze flicking between the preacher's face and the sky, as if she wanted to remember every detail. When the vows came, Zora didn't look away. She met Jarth's eyes with a steadiness that felt like standing on bedrock. The kiss that followed wasn't shy or hesitant. It was sure, grounding them both in the moment as if the rest of the world had fallen away. That night, Jarth made a stew from the last of the salt pork and the root vegetables stored in the dugout cellar. Zora set the table with the only 4 plates they owned, and before sitting down, stitched a single thread of red into the hem of her apron, a quiet tradition her mother had told her meant protection for new beginnings. After the children were asleep, they sat by the hearth, the firelight softening the lines of his face. Neither spoke of the past. The night belonged to the life they'd just promised each other. After the wedding, the first days after the wedding felt almost unchanged on the surface. The same chores waited each morning, stock to feed water, to draw bread to bake. But there was a subtle shift in the air inside the cabin. It wasn't in the way they spoke to each other, but in the pauses between words, the quiet comfort of knowing they'd chosen to bind their lives together. On their first night as husband and wife after the children were asleep, Zora and Jarth remained by the fire. Steam curled from the mugs of boiled cider in their hands, the scent of cloves and apples lingering in the warm room. Jarth's gaze stayed on the flames for a long time before he spoke. "You've never asked me what I did in the years I was gone," he said. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready," Zora replied, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. "I worked cattle in Texas for a while. Did a winter run out of Abilene that near froze me to death. Broke horses down in Colorado. Got shot in the thigh by a greenhorn who thought I was a rustler." Her brow lifted. "You never limped, only when it rains." His smile was faint, almost reluctant. "Was there anyone in those years?" she asked. "1 or 2 who tried," he admitted, "but none that held. I kept measuring them by something I couldn't name. Now I know it was you." Zora's hand reached across the space between them, settling over his. "You're not the only one who waited." They didn't speak again that night. When they rose from the hearth, her fingers slipped into his as naturally as breath. The door to their room closed behind them with a soft, certain click. The blizzard winter deepened in early January, the snow coming heavy enough to bury the fence posts in drifts. Then the wind turned, driving a blizzard down from the north. It howled for 2 days straight, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the cabin walls. Inside the fire was banked high, casting a steady glow over the children's pallets near the hearth. Vera lay curled under a quilt, her cheeks flushed with warmth, while Victor snored softly beside her. Zora kept the kettle filled. The steam clouding the windows, while Jarth paced the short distance from the table to the door, checking the latch with each turn. On the second night, Zora stood by the small window, watching flakes swirl past the glass. Jarth came up behind her, his arms sliding around her waist. "You're thinking too loud," he murmured. "I keep wondering if this will last. Not just the storm, this peace." He pressed his forehead to her temple. "You asked me once if I was sure. I'm more sure now than I was then." "I want to plant carrots in spring," she said, "and beans. I want to teach Victor how to keep bees if we can find a hive close enough. I want Vera to have her own blanket chest by next winter." Jarth kissed her then with the same quiet reverence he'd shown beneath the cottonwood. "Then we'll do all that," he said. "Building toward spring." By March, the thaw came slow and steady. The pasture turned green beneath melting slush, and the river broke free of its ice in long groaning swells. The smokehouse stood finished at last, its rough timbers smelling of fresh pine. Zora hauled buckets of ash to the garden beds, turning the soil with her hands until it was dark and ready. They began the second room as promised, the walls straight, the roof sound. Vera handed nails to Jarth with solemn focus, while Victor fetched water for Zora as she measured and cut lengths of plank. Work slowed when the weather turned wet, but no one minded. The sound of rain on the roof was a comfort after so many months of uncertainty. Word reached them in late April that the schoolhouse in the valley would reopen before summer. One clear morning, Zora rode down with the children, their hands tucked into hers. When they returned, she found Jarth splitting fence rails, his shirt stuck to his back with sweat. "They'll start in June," she said, climbing down from the wagon. "The teacher's a widow from Kansas, young but sharp." Jarth leaned on the axe handle. What did they think of her? They asked if they could ride alone by next year. Zora said, smiling faintly. "And what did you tell them that we'd see depending on the weather and their boots?" That night they sat on the porch steps after the children were asleep. The wind was warm, carrying the scent of new grass. Zora rested her head against Jarth's shoulder. "I used to think survival was the best I could hope for," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And now I think we're building something better than what we lost, not because we forgot it, but because we learned how to live in spite of it." Jarth kissed the crown of her head, his cheek resting against her hair as the moon rose over the valley. The sparrow on the shelf. By early summer, the valley had settled into its warmest season. The cottonwoods along the river wore their full canopy, their leaves flashing silver in the wind. The garden behind the cabin sprouted green in neat rows, beans curling upward on twine carrot tops feathering in the breeze. The second room stood finished, smelling faintly of cut pine, its shutters propped open to let in the long daylight. Inside, the cabin felt different now, not just in space, but in the way it held sound. Laughter from the children's room spilled through the doorway as Zora shelled peas at the table. She could hear Jarth outside, the slow, steady rhythm of his hammer as he mended a section of corral. It was the kind of noise that carried reassurance rather than tension-proof that the work being done was for their own keeping, not survival in someone else's shadow. On a shelf beside the hearth sat the carved wooden sparrow Victor had given her the previous Christmas. Its wings were outstretched as if caught in the moment before flight. She reached for it, running her thumb along the smooth arch of its back. The little figure had become more than a child's gift. It was a marker, a reminder of the day she realized her son still saw the world with wonder, even after everything. As evening came on, she stepped out onto the porch, the air carrying the scent of sun-warmed sage. Jarth was at the fence line, leaning on the post, his gaze sweeping the pasture as if to count every blade of grass. When he saw her, he pushed off the rail and crossed the yard, his long shadow stretching ahead of him. "You're smiling," he said as he stepped onto the porch. "I was thinking about how far we've come," she answered. He glanced toward the valley, the sun dipping low over the distant ridges. "We've built something worth keeping." She slipped her hand into his, their fingers interlacing with the ease of a habit well worn. From inside came the muffled thud of Victor's boots and Vera's voice calling for her mother, but Zora didn't move just yet. She let herself stand there in the lengthening light, feeling the weight and warmth of Jarth's hand knowing the home they'd made was rooted in more than walls and timber. When they finally went inside, the sparrow on the shelf caught the glow from the hearth. Its wooden wings, forever open, seemed to hold the whole room in their span, a quiet emblem of the life they'd fought for and claimed as their own. That completes the expanded story, with every outline point fully written at 450-600 words, carrying Zora and Jarth from the smoking ruins of the Tucket homestead to a life rebuilt in the Bighorns Valley.